This actually should be pretty topical. I just saw somebody this week claiming that they're like, sure, people talk about the monopoly on violence, but it's not really a monopoly on violence. Like,
yeah, I was like partially the reason why I chose it, because I saw it come up and like I don't know if we understand the words being discussed.
Keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Yeah. And I think it has like just an overall the movie has an overall good approach to explaining anarchy from a lot of different perspectives, and you know it's just that's I think most people's objections to anarchy just kind of come from whatever they imagine anarchy is going to be like, and then when you tell them, like, well, no, but that's not what anarchists believe. We believe all these other things that we write about and talk about, and this stuff. They're like, oh, you anarchists with your ideas and your books and stuff, just like the communists. Like, well, okay, but then we can just talk about the ideas and the books and the communists. Like, it's not just like I hate one of my most despised like objections to leftism and to like socialism, communism, is this platitude that, oh, communism works on paper, but then you apply it to the real world and it doesn't work. And in reality, you can talk about the flaws within communist theory, like where it comes from, ideas like dialectical materialism, which is like the basis for Marxist thought and Marx's like whole idea of the conflict between the classes. So, you know, this is all stuff
like
that
their ideas don't even work on paper. They don't work on paper either. They don't work in practice. They don't work on paper. Like, yeah.
Exactly.
Well, plus there's like that one dude that was saying like, you just want anarchy so that you have no repercussions to your actions, and it's like, well, that's not how that works. And then they were like, you just want to have like a weird sex dungeon warlord, and I'm like, where the fuck does this keep coming? Like, why do you keep projecting your weird shit onto me?
Yeah, it's like, frankly bizarre, because you know we're advocating for the erosion of social accountability and the promotion of individual accountability, and somehow this is interpreted as we want to get away with criminal things or violations of other people's rights. And it's like, well, no, we want to make people directly accountable.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, that's why we're constantly complaining about people's rights being violated and shit, because we actually want to violate them. That's why we care so much about individual rights, is because we hate them. Makes sense.
Yeah, you know, of course, warlords are gonna come along and do us all in.
It's goofy.
Yeah, so this movie is very relevant to, I don't know, everybody's knee-jerk reactions, and really all of the little NPC repetitions that you might hear going on in reaction to anarchy. So I thought it'd be fun to check out today.
Yeah, I'm down. And then yeah, this way, I mean, we do it in 2 parts. We'll have time to chit chat about it too, because
yeah, I don't want to just like speed through it. I want to like talk about it. It is a podcast after all.
In your life, you will interact with many different social institutions. There is one institution that is unlike any other, one where you are subservient to others. From the cradle to the grave, you will be regulated, taxed, controlled, indoctrinated, coerced, judged, and possibly killed at the whims of members of this organization. This institution is called the state.
Well, if we're talking about human history in the largest sense of the word, that is to say, Homo sapiens has been around for 200,000 years. The state was invented only, even at the most charitable estimate, um, 8,000 years ago, and then it only touched a small portion of mankind. So the fact is that most of human history has been a history of statelessness. If you ask yourself um, how long people have been ruled by states on a sort of massive level.
But so states are inevitable though, because of human nature. And
Yeah,
needed.
it's inevitable that we'll end up forming these giant, bloated, you know, basically you know, farms for people, because it's just human nature.
Well, you remember that leftist? I don't know. Yeah, I remember you were blogging. The leftist that I was arguing with a while back, where I kept on being like, "Listen, I just value respect for individual autonomy, and that's why I believe taxation is theft." And you seem to like have a problem with this statement, but every time like you respond to it, you don't try to explain why taxation is not theft. You just try to explain why theft is actually okay sometimes, especially when I like it or it's used for my political cause. And they just kept on actually like reaffirming that statement. And I'm like, look, I just want to be clear. Like, I'm anti-authoritarian, and that's why I'm anti-state. And you seem to be authoritarian as long as it's for what you deem to be acceptable measures. And they basically just agreed, but tried not to make it seem like that was bad. And I'm like, okay, well, we're just clear on that now. We're on the same page here.
Yeah, it's like, justify it however the fuck you want. Like, I don't doubt that people have, that believe certain things have justifications for believing them. I'm sure they do. I don't think that they're good justifications, but everybody has a justification for something that they believe. So it's like, yeah, okay, I get it. But we're gonna be honest here about what you're saying. Like, what you actually believe is that, this is okay in certain circumstances, and the circumstances that you agree with it don't uh, negate the fact that you are still by force, um, you know, stealing from people. That's all it is.
Yeah, like so we have exceptions for when it's permissible to use violence, but we're very consistent in terms of the initiation of force and what that means versus the acceptable forms of violence, which is the the reaction of force against violation of rights, right? You cannot initiate violence or initiate force against an innocent person, which in our logic or our ethical structure, an innocent person, is a very well defined thing. It's not a vague, nebulous concept that anybody could apply into. It's that those who are respecting the natural rights of others, whether they be personal autonomy or right of property, any of that, as long as they are respecting and abiding within those purviews and acting voluntarily and peacefully, then they are protected, by those natural rights as well. And if anybody enacts violence upon somebody who's, peacefully as defined before, then they are a violent party. They are an aggressor. They are initiating force, which is different if that other party were to perceive that attack and then respond with force and kind. Then that would not be initiation because they were the innocent. And these are all again well-defined concepts and terms that we talk about incessantly, right? That we talk about all the fucking time. And people are like, well, how will you defend yourself against the warlord? Like, very effectively. That's how.
Aggressively and by whatever means possible. Like, I don't understand the question. And they're like, well, you might fail. And I'm like, okay.
With extreme prejudice. as
with
opposed to the
extreme
state,
prejudice.
as opposed to the
And
state, which is always successful.
yeah, and the thing is that like to a certain extent, within the context of the system that we currently live in, it's like sure, there's plenty of examples of people being um just straight up murdered, by the state. We get that. We're not saying that it's a guarantee that you're going to win every single time. It's not how it works. People, and the other thing that pisses me off about stuff like this is people want to guarantee that everything's going to be perfect, and then they accuse you of promoting a utopian ideology.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so wait, what you want is a perfect system that's held to a higher standard than the one that you even currently have. Like your system hasn't even achieved that. You want this one. You don't want it to be as little better or even different. You want it to be perfect. And you're accusing me of promoting a utopian ideology because I'm telling you that rather than having the state initiate violence against other people constantly in order to preserve not your freedom, but your freedom to be comfortable is what it really is. That you will actually have to, you'll have to possibly fight in order to preserve your freedom.
Yeah, that's why I tell these clowns, fucking remove the 2x4 in your eye before you complain about the splinter in mine. Because
Well,
all of these
it also kind of
complaints about like, or all these alleged things that the state is designed to solve are things that the state has been failing to solve worldwide for
forever.
For forever. And we rightfully attributed their failure to the very concept of concentration of power and monopoly on violence. And I think that like the what is it, the unconstrained vision, right? They can just mold the institutions into the correct manner that will then constrain the people into what they're supposed to, their best self.
Well, yeah, and again, it's one of those like that's a pipe dream. That's utopic because it requires homogeny to function, which you're never going to get in a population of 380 million people. It's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. So it's like when your whole like system depends upon this many factors being absolutely perfect, of course it's going to fail. It's like anarchy doesn't depend on people to be perfect. It makes actually it expects people not to be. The whole foundation is based we reject authority because we know that people aren't perfect. I don't get it. I don't get that where people get this idea that like, well, if people aren't moral, then bad things will happen. And I'm like, okay, that's true. That happens now. People aren't moral and bad things still happen, but the difference is that I'm not giving those people, unfettered fucking power over millions of other people and then letting them write laws and send out goons in uniforms with guns to enforce them.
The power that can protect itself and reinforce itself, and grow, like some sort of little, monster from the Black Lagoon. And
it always does. Like there has never been a like nobody, and that's the thing. Oh well, anarchy's never. You can't point to a functioning anarchist society, right? That's the big like takeaway. And then I go, okay, point to a functioning minarchist society. Point to it. Like point to a society where the state only controls the banks and only controls the military and only controls the police and only controls the courts. And is still a minarchy. Like still has minimal control. Point to it. Go ahead. And they can't. They never can. And it's like, okay, then shut the fuck up.
Yeah, where's your success?
I asked myself,
exactly.
At what point in history do you imagine that more than half of mankind would have experienced regular tax collection, right? Once a year or something like that. There might be plunder from time to time, right? But irregular, episodic, and the existence of a state in most people's life did not come into being for more than half of mankind until around 1600. If we take the history of mankind as a day, the state comes into being at about 11:30 at night, right? And it becomes hegemonic at sort of 11:40, right? 11:45 or 11:50, and the thing that qualifies this, of course, is that there's a whole lot fewer Homo sapiens around in these early days. Even Western cities until maybe 1800, 1850 never reproduced themselves by their internal population. That is to say, they were so deadly because of typhoid and disease and epidemics and so on, that they killed more people than that is, their population could not grow internally. That all of these cities grew by bringing in more people from the countryside because they had high rates of mortality. The reason the state form has proven so durable and virtually universal is that it takes a state to beat a state. And so if you think of the early states, that is, the early states were all founded in floodplains where you had concentrated agriculture and could concentrate a large population. And that's why they tended to be units that were more powerful militarily than a scattered and fragmented countryside around them. And in fact, they grew by plundering that population, by enclosing that population, of bringing it in, having them plant grain, and capturing people. So I try to show in Against the Grain that most of the wars of these early states were wars of capture in order to grab populations. This is true for the Athenians as well. Grab population, bring them in, have them produce for the center or work in the quarries.
Kingdoms expanded into empires. Dominant kingdoms expanded by conquest, suppressing people in new territories. A hierarchy of governors managed the increasing complexity of empires. A new system appeared in which power was given to the people in the form of votes. Democracy diluted the absolute power of authorities, but introduced demagogues and the tyranny of the majority. Civilization expanded. More decision-making power was delegated. Some political power became subordinated to laws, but delegating power, especially military power, risked a return to empire. Combining features of a democracy with a republic, nations set up basic rights subordinating more political power to the rule of law. Over time, however, special interests found a way to use politics to their advantage.
Within a state, I think it's fair to say that you have got the standard aspects of what we all associate with the state, which is tax collection, a system of centralized punishment and centralized monopoly over violence, so that executions that are legal executions can only be conducted by the state. What's important to sort of recognize is that until starting perhaps with the French Revolution, which was an emancipatory movement, and the idea that people in all of France were governed by the same law no matter who they were everywhere in France, that there were no serfs anymore. You were not under the personal lordship of an aristocrat or of the priestly control. The French Revolution marks that point in which the state comes to see as one of its goals the collective welfare of the people. Notice that the French Revolution did two things. It also made all Frenchmen equal in theory. It took a long time for that to come into practice, especially for women. But it also made everyone directly ruled by the state.
As populations increased, states grew more sophisticated, controlling not just law, taxation, and the military, but eventually education, social services, central banking, and much of the economy.
I feel like somebody warned against the state specifically controlling education, because if the state can control education, then there will literally never be anybody who can criticize or check the state effectively, because they're just,
They're speaking against established
constantly,
knowledge. Yeah, against the.
yeah. And they write the history, they teach the generations
Oh, I
that,
remember when like some of my like school friends like heard that like I thought FDR was a scumbag, and they're like, "What? But he signed the New Deal, and the New Deal was wonderful." And I'm like, "Ah, shut." No, it
what
was
was
not.
it though? Like, was it, do you actually think the New Deal was wonderful, or did somebody tell you that and you got an A for saying it? Like, what are
And
the what are the repercussions of the New Deal?
and of course, one thing I always reiterate about the state is that the state uh doesn't actually comprise like any one person, right? And it isn't actually real in terms of, just like a corporation isn't real, right? These are the same people that want to say, oh, corporation isn't a real person, blah blah blah. And it's like, well, yeah, neither is the state. That's why the state can't do anything, and the state doesn't have anything, and anything the state does have to use, it's stole from somebody else.
Right, like a good way I've heard of putting it, or at least the way somebody spelled it out, that it's like I understood the concept like immediately when they said it, because I was like, oh, of course, yeah, that makes sense. But I just never heard it put into words. Basically, that the state is not corporeal; it is not a physical thing, right? We see physical
Mm-hmm.
representations of the state's power through individuals who work for the state, but the state itself is not an actual, touchable, tangible thing. It's literally just a system of control. And so um I mean, yeah, it's not real. Like, it's not an actual thing. It's literally just like a set of ideas and ideals and, again, laws and stuff, but it's all having to be enforced by actual real people. Like, the state cannot be, you can't point at it. You can't be like, there it is, there's the state. Even if you point at the White House, it's like, well, yeah, but not really, because, you could
Yeah,
shoot Joe Biden tomorrow, and the
and
United States of America would just keep on rolling.
most importantly, anything that you would have the state do uh, is done through illegitimately gotten means, because the state doesn't naturally produce anything or possess anything through
Right, it
voluntary
relies
means.
on taking. It has to take everything from people.
Laws inform citizens what rules the state has decided they will obey. What began as a codification of norms became a way for special interests to control others.
The Protestant Reformation made people, the idea is that everyone can interpret the Bible on their own. So they start thinking of moral decrees from God, and now legal decrees from the state as what's written down on paper and issued by a sovereign. This is the statist way of thinking, and it's not what law used to be until the modern revolution of the modern concept of the state, which is only about 200 or 300 years old, like the Westphalian concept of the state.
So Madison is probably the pivotal person in American history as the scrivener of the Constitution, as the chair of the House of Representatives committee that drafted the Bill of Rights. He believed, we know this from what he said in his retirement, that he gave us a government which was liberty of individuals granting power. It wasn't like great in Europe where power, kings reluctantly granted liberty. So in Madison's view, the American system was the inversion of the European view.
Unlike all the strictures imposed on us by states, states themselves are chaotic. States aren't required to follow any rules. There's no rule of law. That's a mythology that we cling to. States can do what they want, and they are the judge of their own actions. They're the judge of their own criminality. They're the judge of their own civil penalties. I mean, this is a bizarre state of affairs where maybe 1% of the population, 3 million or so federal employees, get to dictate to the other 329 million of us how things are going to be. and they're the sole arbiter of their own actions. This, to me, is chaotic.
State education produces people who believe in and perpetuate the state's preferred way of thinking.
The origins of the American education system start in the 19th century with reformers, so-called moral reformers, people like Horace Mann and others, who went to Prussia and found a system of education there that they wanted to emulate in the United States, which they did, and they brought it back here. And they established the modern public schooling system and the idea of a modern industrial capitalist curriculum. And they explicitly stated at the time, these reformers who established the schools in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, they said at the time that what we need is to create citizens with these schools, which meant people who knew how to work under industrial capitalism in a factory, and soldiers, people who were willing to fight and die for the country. So they needed to instill in people a regimentation, the idea that people can and should be made into machines, functionaries for a new civilization, a new modern civilization, where there were large factories and large armies. So the school system was designed purposely that way, and that's why we have the bell.
It's like we've talked about that before.
Yeah. Or we heard this.
And it's even funnier because it's like, again, you get accused of, oh, it's a conspiracy theory, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, the people who built the system said that this was what it was for. They explicitly stated that this is what they wanted to do, and lo and behold, it has produced fruit, and you keep denying that this is the way that the system was designed. It's like, don't fucking tell me shit that I can look at with my own two eyes and understand. It's like, I didn't even have to know that to understand that even if that wasn't their intent, this is how the system functions. But it turns out this is exactly how they wanted it to work.
Yeah, it's called the Prussian model, and we know what that is and where it came from and who brought it over here. This is the well-established education history, and we still use the Prussian model, or at least we did when I was growing up, to this day. And so yeah, it's not even a secret, really. It's literally how it came to America.
Bell system where the students move from class to class through the day, just like on an assembly line, and they are filled with one piece of information here and then filled with another piece of information there. So they become both products of the assembly line and they become the managers of the assembly line, ideally. It's compulsory and universal, the education system. So you are obligated by law to send your child to a school that is approved of by the state. Now, it can be your own school, but it has to be approved by the state. Most of us don't have that luxury for various reasons, and especially poor people and working class people, so they have to send their kids, most of them, to government-run schools, where they are obligated to stay by law from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., no matter what. And if they leave, they are truants. They become criminals, and their parents are liable to arrest and prosecution and imprisonment. And the job of the teachers, sure, is to educate them with whatever the state deems to be a proper education, but it's also to keep them in those seats and in those rooms and in those buildings. If the kid decides to get up and be a free human being and leave that building, the teacher is the first person to tell him to stop, and the first person to call security to force him to stay. That's prison. It's a day prison. It's a minimum security prison, but it's a prison. If I don't send my son to that school, I go to prison, or I can go to prison. If he leaves the school, plays hooky, he will probably get picked up by the police, detained, labeled a truant, and then brought back to the prison.
Services offered by government are not based on voluntary contract. The state expropriates its subjects' wealth by compulsory taxation.
So why are they taxing us at all? That's a good question. I think it goes back to the idea of taxes as a tool of compliance and terror.
A budget is you planning ahead, and taxes is a method of procuring funds. So a budget means I sat down, I thought out my enterprise, it accounts for about this much. This is what I need over this period of time to account for operations. When you have a method of procuring your budget by just yanking more, you get to use ignorant excuses like, well, we're not succeeding, so we need more money. That's not a correlation. maybe these people are incompetent and they're squandering your money for, it doesn't make sense when you start breaking all the things down.
The corp.
There was one debate that was a classic Thomas Sowell video from, I think that was the 70s, with some lady in like the Department of Education, and Sowell was going on about how absurd it was that you give funding to schools that are doing bad, and they're like, so they're basically rewarded for doing worse, and then once they start to do better, the funds are removed, and so they're punished for improving. And that's not the incentive structure that you want to place upon something you want to succeed and to do better.
No, absolutely not.
Corporations don't pay taxes. Business entities don't pay taxes. Only people pay taxes, because a tax is a burden. It's something that we bear almost in a physical, visceral sense. It's a way to ensure that Americans are docile and that Americans are frightened of their government. Because that's the number one interaction most people have with the federal government, is their annual tax form. The amount of tax revenue that government takes in doesn't cover everything it spends. And so to make up the difference, obviously they sell treasury debt. So, as bizarre as it sounds, if a portion of the federal government's budget can be funded by debt, arguably the whole thing could be. We could have no income taxes, and the $4 trillion that the U.S. Fed Gov spends every year could be financed via treasury debt, and then ultimately monetized by the Fed.
Central banks have significant control over the economies they govern. The Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, determines interest rates, controls the money supply, picks winners and losers, and enables nearly limitless government spending.
Increase in money supply, keeping the interest rates low. It turns out that is very beneficial for the federal government. The federal government, whenever they spend more than they take in tax revenues, they have to borrow. And just like anybody else has to borrow, we have to go to the credit markets and we have to borrow at the prevailing interest rate. Well, when the federal government, who has the ability to tax, they already get a lower interest rate than the rest of us. They're able to borrow more when already the servicing on the debt, the interest payments on the debt, are already one of our biggest expenses. With the debt that's, what is it now, $23 trillion. With that kind of debt, anybody else's credit would have run out a long time ago. They are able to keep on doing this because the interest rates are low. So the Fed's role in allowing the government to overspend on all kinds of things, but the biggest one would be military, on these wars, endless wars. They're able to keep doing that because they're just able to borrow at lower rates.
Absolute monarchs, when they got into wars, sometimes they'd run out of money. The treasury would run dry, so armies could not be paid, and they would stop battling in the field and go back. Wars are extremely expensive. Had Americans been forced to pay by taxation for the Vietnam War, it would have stopped a lot sooner than it did. America could simply print money and buy the things it needed to fight the war without having to raise taxes. So it's because it spares people from having to pay a visible price for the war that the war can go on.
Remember that clown that was like, oh, the deficit means nothing, it just fucking is pretend, so don't worry about it.
Don't worry about the deficit. It's just a big number. Like, don't worry about it.
No, it's exactly how they have siphoned more wealth away from all of us, especially the poor and the middle class primarily, and are able to fund all of the horrible nation building and imperialism that leftists supposedly hate so much.
Through this, yeah. And again, it's like the goddamn Federal Reserve. Isn't it? It's always the goddamn Federal Reserve.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it just seems like it all comes back to the goddamn Federal Reserve, and it's like, okay, so, like, how, and yeah,
Well,
I mean,
it
and
is one of the
people
most
are,
important aspects of our society is how our money works and how it can be exploited behind our backs just through the structuring of that system. It's so important to being able to do
and
anything.
this is just one piece, right, of the whole thing. Like, this is just one tiny little piece of the whole fucking machine.
Oh yeah, well I mean
And it
they're
has
just
this much.
they're just touching upon the aspect of the state's expanded spending power. That's just
Right.
that's just the back end. Yeah, it's not even
That's what I'm
talking
saying. It's
about.
like it's like one tiny little piece of the whole thing, and that's why it frustrates me when people are like, "Okay, so you want me to think real hard about this and be critical of the system and think that maybe this isn't the best way." Well, you're not really doing anything, and so nothing's gonna change. And it's like, no, that this is exactly how things change. Is that people have to start paying attention to shit like this and understanding how it works and why people are critical of it and why people are saying that no, you can't fix this. It's bigger than you and it's bigger than everybody. Like, there is no, this is literally people that talk about voting and like fixing the system through that. They are pick yourself up by your bootstrap idiots. I'm sorry. You're never gonna do it
Yeah, and it's just absurd to me
because there are
this idea that that anarchists are somehow like these whiny, like, oh, you just hate any kind of state that anybody would form. It's like, well, this is the kind of shit that it gets into. It's not just
well, yeah,
doesn't
that's the thing.
just
It's like,
stop with your good intentions.
well, yeah, because to them, they still have this idea that there would be a perfect state, right? Because that's the mindset, that's the mentality that they're in, and that we're trying to get them out of. It's a very stubborn cycle to break out of. I get it because this is the only thing we've ever known, and like it's scary to think about, this whole support system that you've always had your whole life for generations being whipped out from underneath you. I guess is what people are expecting to happen. Um, but it's like in actuality, what we're really trying to get them to do is we're like, listen, you've got a bear trap clamped on your leg, and we're saying that you would be better off without it.
Yeah, it's not a minor
It's
thing.
no, it's not a support system. It's not saving you. It's not saving anyone really. It's you're compromising. You're just shifting all of this damage that you think is going to happen. You're just shifting it somewhere else in such a way that you're not seeing it and it's being kept out of your sight and it's still happening. And that's why again, it's like people don't want to be free, they want to be comfortable. That's what they really want. When they really talk about freedom, I think a lot of the times people are really just talking about the freedom to be comfortable. They're not actually talking about being free because free comes with a lot of discomfort and a lot of danger and a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, as it
But
should.
that's what, yeah, as it should. That's what it takes. People have to be better. Like, people have to rise to that fucking challenge and be better.
Yeah, instead of outsourcing their solutions to the state, well, that means that the problems still need to get solved, but in amongst peaceful means, voluntary
Right.
means. That's okay.
State military conflicts destroy human lives, pollute the environment, impoverish millions of people, and waste scarce resources in pursuit of state political goals.
Regardless of whether they admit it or not, through all sources, about $1 trillion goes to the so-called defense budget. Now, that not only includes the $600 or $700 billion to DoD, but also State Department, a lot of U.S. aid, a lot of other things in the federal budget are really defense spending masquerading as something else. Well, government's too big and we need to cut spending. If they're not talking about defense, if they're not talking about entitlements, they're not being serious. There's no amount of cutting we could do in any other part of the government that would make a meaningful difference.
As Randolph Bourne famously put it, war is the health of the state. right? The state benefits in lots of ways, directly and indirectly, from war. I mean, everybody remembers Orwell's 1984 and the idea that war was so endemic that you didn't even know who the current enemy was. And they kept switching it around, right? So people didn't care. They just knew that they were constantly in a state of warfare, which of course, allows the state to justify a lot of infringements on personal and community liberty that we would normally not tolerate, right? Oh, well, we're in a time of war, so we have to read your emails and we have to spy on what you're doing and make sure that the enemy
Man, that sounds
hasn't infiltrated
dystopian
our
and
midst.
unlikely.
The
That would
reason
never
that
happen.
Most people go along with that, albeit with some grumbling, is because they have been told we're at war. We're at war with terrorists who would want to blow up airplanes and want to hurt you, and etc. So you've got to sacrifice some of your liberty for the security that we, the government, offers.
Well, this is an example of the U.S. government creating problems that it has the appearance then of solving. We created a problem in Libya with our foreign policy of regime change of the Gaddafi regime. When we did unleash hell on the people of Libya, chaos broke out, as could be expected, as could be predicted, as we predicted. And that also then that in turn requires more intervention, because you had jihadists moving into Chad and Niger and elsewhere. So you had to create more intervention to solve the problems that your intervention creates. But the U.S. uses jihadists, they use extremists as cat paws. They use it in Syria. They use the most violent Islamist extremists in Syria, places like Syria, to overthrow a completely secular regime, government. And we saw how many hundreds of thousands have died. The global war on terror is ramped up and ramped down on Washington's as Washington needs new enemies or doesn't need new enemies. It's in the most it's fabricated, in the very least. It's something that's created by our foreign policy.
It's the same thing from the Reagan years, the Clinton years, and really some during H.W. Bush, but especially during the Bill Clinton years, and then again during Bush and Obama. America uses these jihadi, Saudi-backed Sunni suicide bomber terrorists.
Hey, I recognize that guy.
But we've heard from this dude before. Yeah. Because, I mean, you gotta have Scott Horton on to talk about exactly what the American war state has been up to.
I was going to say, they started talking about American foreign policy. I was going to be a little surprised if they didn't have him, on here, I think it would have been to their detriment to not, because he knows what he's fucking talking about all the time.
Yeah.
American imperial ends. Our government hates their adversaries more than they hate our blood enemies, who have slaughtered Americans by the thousands and American soldiers by the thousands in Iraq War II as well. This is how crazy their priorities are compared to what the American people believe they were giving them the writ to do, to protect us from these terrorist groups. And of course, Obama's support for al-Qaeda in Syria led to the rise of the Islamic State. In 2013, they conquered all of eastern Syria. In 2014, they rolled into all of western Iraq, all of Iraqi Sunnistan. And the Islamo-fascist caliphate that had been bin Laden's wildest dream from the attic he was hiding in, and had been George Bush's most phony propaganda from the era of his terror war in Iraq, had become true. Bush opened up western
Ain't
Iraq.
that fucking ironic?
And then Obama backed them to the hilt.
I mean, again, not like anybody was talking about that being a possibility beforehand, especially since it had already happened in Afghanistan. It led to 9/11.
And it's like how many times does this kind of thing have to happen? And I have my own skepticisms. I think it's going to happen again with everything that's happening in Iran right now. I think it's going to happen again. I think that we're getting to the point where like the Ukraine thing is starting to get old. Like, yeah, we're still throwing money at them, but I think that they're already gearing up for like another thing, because now you have all this instability going on in Iran, and it's like, oh, we're gonna have to sweep in and save the people of Iran now. Like, I don't know. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I honestly really, really, really hope I'm wrong. But it seems like a really good opportunity for that sort of thing. And from what I've understood, we don't usually waste those kind of opportunities.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. got its tentacles in there somehow.
Somehow, yeah.
In Syria, to such a degree, they were able to erase the Sykes-Picot border between Syria and Iraq and declare a brand new Islamist caliphate. And they had seized a territory the size of Great Britain, which they held for 3 years, before America had then, guess what, of course, had to ally with the Shia in Iraq, the Badr Brigade, the Iraqi Shiite army, and all of those Iranian-backed militias. America flew as their air force. The same guys our government wished they hadn't fought for in Iraq War II, they ended up fighting for them again in Iraq War III. And even now, our special operations forces are embedded with these, well, certainly the Iraqi army, but essentially 1 degree away from these very same Shiite militias. The ones that Donald Rumsfeld had used back in 2005 when he called it the El Salvador option. His death squads to hunt down the Sunnis. We're playing that same game right now. And so America is on both sides of this terror war all over the region. Same kind of thing is going on in Yemen. The war in Yemen is against an Iranian-backed group called the Houthis, who've taken over the capital city. And it has put the USA, with our Saudi and UAE allies, again, directly on the side of Al-Qaeda, flying as their air force against their primary enemies, the Houthis. And even the AP and CNN have reported about Al-Qaeda embedded with UAE forces driving American MRAP, IED-resistant vehicles, and participating in the slaughter of civilians in that war. Again, with America flying as Al-Qaeda's air force against an enemy that has a friendly relationship with Iran. Not that Iran attacked us. At this point, it seems like through the Clinton, Bush, Obama, and now into the Trump governments, to see that this bait and switch continues on should mean to the American people, to any of us, libertarians or anyone else, that this government is not fit to be our security force. Our security is not its priority.
Democide is when a government kills its own people. In the 20th century, it's been estimated 256 million people were killed by their own government. That's 6 times greater than the amount who died in wars.
Government and the military, the U.S. military, and other militaries around the world, but primarily we want to look at communist countries or socialist countries who killed vast numbers of their own populations. I think that's the greatest indictment against socialism and communism, is that the Soviet Union killed millions of its own people, starved them to death with famine. They did the same thing in Red China, where tens and tens of millions of their own citizens were killed off. And so government, particularly when you see where the level of government is highest, and that's in socialism and communism in particular. Cambodia is another example where a high percentage of the Khmer Rouge regime killed off millions of Cambodians. So the biggest problem in the world in terms of modern history has been communist dictators killing off their own citizens.
Numerous arguments have been used in attempts to justify the state's authority. For a time, it was the divine right of kings. More modern justifications argue the state's authority comes from the consent of its people, often referred to as the social contract.
There are basically
the social
three
contract.
versions of social contract. There's like the explicit contract theory, the implicit contract theory, and the hypothetical contract theory. The
I want to read
explicit
his
contract
book.
theory, the implicit contract theory, 3 versions of.
Referred to as the social contract.
There are basically three versions of social contract. There's like the explicit contract theory, the implicit contract theory, and the hypothetical contract theory. But the explicit contract theory might sound like a straw man, but it's not. So it's the theory that some people actually literally got together and said to each other, hey, let's establish a government. Like they literally explicitly agreed with each other either writing it down or saying it in words. That might sound like a straw man. Nobody thinks that really happened, but actually John Locke thought that happened. So he thought that with all of the cities, there was a time like when a city was first founded, there was a time when the founders got together and explicitly agreed that they were going to set up a government for their city. Okay, and then, so it was explicit for the first generation. Then according to Locke, it's only implicit for the later generations, okay, because he's not totally stupid. But the explicit contract theory, that's basically not true. So the governments that control, the land existing today, almost all of them got it by conquest or usurpation. This is discussed in David Hume's famous essay of the original contract. So conquest meaning a bunch of people sail from Europe over to this place that we're in now, and they just kick the shit out of the people who are living there and take the land. And that's how we have control of the land, okay? Usurpation is where, there's a government and then somebody just takes over the government by force. Like there's a military coup, they set up a new government. The hypothetical contract theory is a theory that, people would agree to set up a government. This didn't actually happen because you weren't actually given a choice and there was already a government when you were born. But if somebody asked you and if you were rational, you would have agreed to have a government, right? And then, so that makes it okay to impose a government on you. Okay, now there are some cases where a hypothetical agreement is valid. Namely, it's valid if it's impossible to actually ask the person and you have good reason to believe that they would in fact consent based upon their actual beliefs and values. So there's an accident victim who's been brought into the hospital and they're unconscious, and you need consent to operate on them, but the person's unconscious. The doctors go ahead anyway, and the argument is, look, almost certainly this person would consent to be operated on because almost everyone values their life, and etc. But it doesn't work if, first of all, you can ask the person and you just don't want to because you're afraid they're going to say no. Okay, so then you cannot appeal to hypothetical consent. Secondly, it doesn't work if you say, they would consent if they had different philosophical beliefs from their actual beliefs. So no, you can't do that, right? So, and that would be required for the hypothetical consent to the government. Because there are actual people, they're called anarchists, who we know would not consent. Okay, but that's...
Shout out to your boy. Right. No, but yeah, he's got a point there. It's you only get to your social contract agreement by ignoring the existence of anarchists or by, logicking away their consent.
They would consent if they had and that's a big one. I think that's one that people get to without really realizing it a lot. A lot. They would if they were smarter, or they would if they
knew
weren't
what was
so
good
stupid.
for them.
Knew what was good for them, right? We're doing what's best for everyone, and the minority is just going to have to. I mean, that's democracy, isn't it? I mean, is that not democracy? The majority rules, and the minority has to kind of get over it because this is what's best for everyone, and you just have to deal with it. And it's okay. I mean, is that? It's not how it works. I mean, and again, it's yeah, sure. The majority rules, in the simplest of terms, might sound good at first if you have that perspective of I guess, I mean, really the only place it comes from is that might makes right. I mean, that's what majority rules is.
Majority rules also means that minority drools, and are you going to get behind that statement?
Well, what's goofy too is this: it can only be made, and I've only ever seen it made with the assumption that the minority, are
would win somehow.
Evil. They're evil. The minority is always evil, right?
Or the good minority. The reason why the good minority would still win, in the democracy when you democratize,
right?
Because they would still get representation or some shit.
Right. They would eventually appeal, or because they're on the merit of their ideas, they would appeal to enough people, or the right people, or the people with the right morals in order to get this to work. And it's like, well, here's the problem: is that historically that has never played. Well, it's played out that way sometimes, I suppose, but it's also not played out that way several times. And so people, I think, you can at least get people to understand that mob rule is bad when they are the opposition party. And that's the only time I can ever get people to understand it, right? You appeal to the people that are getting everything they want. They don't give a shit if mob rule is immoral. They're winning. They don't care. But when they're losing and when they're constantly getting pummeled and all kinds of shit is happening that they don't like, suddenly mob rule is bad. And I'm like, okay, so now you understand the concept. I'll see you again in 2 years when you win and you don't understand it anymore, So it's annoying. It's like mob rule is still mob rule, even if you think that this is the moral choice, because you're still forcing other people to, do that. You're basically saying, fuck you, I don't care. We're gonna enforce my moral code today, or my lawful. I would say lawful code, because a lot of laws aren't based on morals. I don't know. It's just I don't understand how this isn't. I mean, this is a really simple concept. There's only so many ways I can explain it, because it
just
is
be
a very.
consistently anti-authoritarian, and you're there already.
I think that's the key, is the consistency. There is no consistency in a lot of this stuff, and again, it's like, yeah, well, consistency is kind of the crux of the problem, isn't it? Is that if you're consistent with this kind of stuff, you end up where we are, which is pissing everybody off who's not, because these kind of systems, this two-party system and all this shit, requires people not to be consistent.
Sorry, I'm right. I mean,
with their ideals.
If what I was believing, if my beliefs were incorrect, then I would just believe the correct thing instead. So
yeah,
I apologize, people. No, because this is what I.
Yeah.
That's not generally legitimate. So, like, if you have a patient who they wouldn't consent to be operated on, because, like, they've said that many times when they were conscious, you can't say, oh, they would consent. Also, if you have the patient and they're perfectly conscious and you just don't want to ask them, like, that's not legitimate. You can't say, I don't want to ask the patient because I'm afraid he might say no, so I'm just going to argue that he probably would say yes, or we're just going to, like, gas him and then do the operation.
That's some Dr. House shit.
Okay, that's like the situation with the government. Why is the government not, like, they could ask us. They could, like the IRS, when they send out your tax return, they could have a question on it that says, do you agree to the federal government of the United States? And then if you say no, then you could get a full refund of your taxes. I wonder why they're not doing that. And it's not because they already know everyone would agree. It's because they know too many people would not agree. And then they would have to give back the money, and they don't want to give it back.
So when a young person reaches an age of consciousness, where they might be able to reasonably think about and read about the nature of government for themselves, their friendly local city councilman or congressman or governor or whomever doesn't come over and say, well, hello, young citizen X, pleased to meet you. I'd like to offer you my governmental services, which will include road and police and fire and courts and colleges and all kinds of wonderful things. And in exchange, here's some contract terms. If you sign this, you agree, let's say at the state level, to pay an 8% annual income tax, and there'll be some sales and property taxes along with it. But it's all going to work out swimmingly for you, and you're really going to like this. And so this young person takes a look at it and says, well, that's interesting. I appreciate this, and you haven't stuck a gun in my face, at least yet, but I'd like to shop around a bit. Well, hold on a minute. It turns out there is no shopping around. It turns out that this contract being offered to you is kind of one-sided. We have a monopoly provider for these services. And it turns out that the price you're going to pay for these services can be changed almost at will by the service provider himself and his cronies in the legislature. So all this would be a very odd form of contract for most people. And then if it turns out that even when you couldn't shop around, you couldn't even say no. In other words, if this young person said, I'm going to go live out in the woods by myself, and I'm not going to use your roads, and I'm not going to use your schools, I'm not going to use your fire and police, and I'm not going to pay. That sounds fair, right? I'm not using your services, what you're trying to impose upon me. Well, it turns out that even then, no, you still have to pay your 8% tribute as a citizen of State X. So this is a very odd form of contract if we look at it that way.
Some argue that democracy is what makes state authority justified.
People who appeal to democracy, usually they appear to have a simplistic view that like all of the laws that are passed are authorized by the people. So that, to begin with, is really questionable. It's very possible to have laws that are not accepted by the majority of people. So obvious cases would be like in 2008 to 9, the bailout of the big banks was very unpopular among both Democrats and Republicans, but just the voters, not the politicians. It was popular among the politicians, and they passed it anyway. And that's just an illustration of the fact that, however you want to account for what.
And you remember that? If you remember back to that one video of why government fails, like a lot of these, favorable like earmarks and like minor legislative changes for that favor corporations in various ways. They're very easy to get passed because of the idea of concentrated benefit and diffused cost, and that the corporation has a very concentrated interest in this favorable legislation because of X benefit, and the cost to everybody else is diffused over the entire population. So it's a very minor increase in taxes or whatever it is, and therefore most individual people aren't going to investigate the source of a fraction of a penny difference in their taxes. So then those sorts of things get passed all the time, and the system is designed to have those special interests focus on those things and to have them ignored by the general public by the nature of that concentrated benefit and diffused cost.
Laws do get passed that most people don't support. Okay. Second thing to say is, who cares if most people support it, right? So, the question is, if a larger number of people want to do something that would otherwise be morally wrong, does it become morally permissible because there's a larger number of people who support it than are against it? So generally not. Right? Like there's no other.
I know the answer.
So there's 5 people in the room. 4 of them want to beat up the 5th person. They decide to take a vote on whether beating up the 5th person is okay. Only 1 person opposes it. No, I'm against beating you. Okay, and now, so now the 4 people can beat up the 5 because there were more of them. It's a majority rule. Okay, so nobody thinks that makes it okay to beat up the person. Nobody thinks that suspends the person's rights. You can just go through any other circumstance that doesn't involve the government. You wouldn't say an action that was initially wrong becomes okay if a majority of people support it.
So as the great Tom Woods always says, it's my favorite analogy ever. He said, well, imagine Walmart ran all the schools, and you had to send your kids to an institution run by Walmart. And every morning they had to pledge allegiance to Walmart, and you had pictures of all the Walmart CEOs all around the room, and they would tell you all these fantastic, tales of, well, the first Walmart CEO never told a lie, and, like all this, just the outright lies and propaganda. And then you had a society that was, really favored Walmart. And you're like, why do you think they like Walmart so much? Well, it's because they're being propagandized from the time they're children. And, propaganda works.
What the states keep out of history textbooks are the things that call into question the existence of the states themselves. That call into question the existence of our form of governance, that call into question the existence of a nation state to begin with.
tell us that human nature is the state.
They call into existence, call into question
That's
the
the
existence of
exact.
order.
That's the exact. I
Governments,
just saw this
police,
point made today.
Yeah.
Like I just saw this point made today. Somebody asking, well, then how come, if anarchy works, then how come I've never heard of a successful one happening? And it's like, well, first of all, because you're not supposed to. And like it was a legitimate question. I think the person that it was being asked of reacted a little strongly, but then again, when you've been asked the same question 12 times in a week by various bad actors and you happen to get one person who is legitimately curious, I can understand. And he did kind of like try to go back and actually answer the question. But it's like, well, first of all, yeah, because you're not supposed to hear about it. Why would the state teach you about its competitor? Why would the state ever teach you about its competitor? Like, why would it ever choose to do that? I mean, it's like fucking advertising for your competition. You wouldn't do that. It's not in your best interest to do it, so they're not going to teach you about these things. Your compulsory education through the state is never going to involve, well, here are some other solutions to state power, because at best you're going to get, here are some solutions to our form of here are some worse examples of other states that have existed, and our state is the best.
Yeah, it's like here's what
the
states
problem,
used to be like, and then look what
Yeah.
they are now. Ours.
because there's definitely
Isn't that
no.
awesome?
I mean, we all learn about the dangers of communism in school, right? Rightfully so, but not giving credit to the state for doing this. Like they're not doing it because they don't like communism. They're doing it because they don't like competition. The same way why, fascists and communists actually have a shitload in common, but they don't like each other. It's like, yeah, they are in direct competition with each other for power. So of course, they're gonna shit all over each other when they're talking about each other. It makes sense. But yeah, like the state would never teach you about this kind of stuff. The state is never going to teach you about this kind of stuff. And it's like, and yet we're watching a documentary right now full of people who learned otherwise from somewhere because people have been talking about this shit for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I mean, I get that like telling someone to educate themselves isn't necessarily an answer all the time. Like, I get why it's not sufficient. I do. Like, there's a time to sit down and have a frank one-on-one conversation with somebody who is actually willing to learn. But when people get shitty about it and they say, well, how the fuck do you know that any of this is true? And, you don't know what you're talking about. And it's like, well, we do. And I'm not saying that I'm an expert here. I'm saying that other people have been building on this philosophy and this idea for a very long time. And it seems like they might have a fucking point because they just can't stop being right.
But
it's like when a
It's just I find it
Sorry, go ahead.
incredibly I just find it incredibly shallow and unimpressive when somebody like claims to know that anarchy doesn't work and then it's the same old ridiculous human nature, warlords, states will always
Annoying.
arise. And it's like, yo,
Yeah.
if you had some criticisms against anarchist ideas and you were familiar with them, and you claim to be arrogantly that like anarchism doesn't work because X, Y, and Z, and then that displayed some understanding of what anarchists believed, okay, I will entertain your thoughts and we'll have an argument or discussion, or we'll talk about it. But for like you to come here and be like anarchy doesn't work because of XYZ thing that anarchists have fucking talked about a million times for years and years on
Want to
end.
be a rapist warlord.
Like then like why I'm just not here for, I don't have to fucking respect it because it's not only that like you have like beginner level questions, it's that you're like arrogant about the fact that we are the ones who don't see clearly something that we've fucking seen millions of times. like the presumptiveness of being like, you just don't realize this, and it's like we've not only realized it, we're fucking tired of it. Shut the fuck up.
Seems right. And I don't know. I mean, I guess like I recognize that it seems petty, or at least part of me thinks that it seems petty to point it out. But like every time I get criticized by somebody for being anarchist and holding certain views, every time I get criticized by somebody who's at least closer to my side, I wouldn't say closer to my side of the political spectrum, but they're on the right, they're more conservative or libertarian, right? Every single time I get criticized by some kind of you know, minarchist libertarian or conservative, and they say anarchy is a pipe dream and you don't have a fucking idea what you're talking about. I always it pisses me off because I'm like, then why the hell are you borrowing all of our philosophies and ideals like every time something doesn't go your way? Because this kind of shit always ends up coming up. Like you want to see a conservative pull a 180 and start talking about how much they hate government and the state is when they're losing. And then when they're winning, they turn around and they say, nope, nope, everything's working fine. This is the will of the people, right? And it's convenient because that's the exact same thing that liberals and progressives say when things are going their way, right?
Yeah,
Weird how that seems to
authoritarianism
work.
can just be used for good sometimes, actually.
Yeah, but again, it's like when things aren't going right, out come all the fucking quotes from all. I mean, dude, that motherfucker quoted Dune at me. That motherfucker quoted Frank Herbert at me and thought that it was a concession that aristocracy was the natural form of human society that we would always trend to. And I'm like, you moron, did you even read the book? Did you understand what it fucking meant? Because at no point was that Frank Herbert saying this is what we should do. Yeah, we should absolutely just, whatever. We're always going to trend towards hierarchy and aristocracy is what humans just naturally, flock to. It's like, dude, you didn't fucking understand what you were reading, and how dare you fucking quote that at me like it's some kind of support for statism.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure people have tried to quote Tolkien to the same effect as well, which amazing.
Unbelievable. And it's like yeah, it drives me up a fucking wall because I'm like, you tell me that I don't understand these things and that I'm stupid and naive, and then you turn around and do something so blatantly stupid and ignorant as that. It's like I don't even feel like debating those kind of people. I can't
No.
debate them. There is no debate. It's like, you're an idiot. I'm not wasting my time on you anymore. And then of course, you get criticized for being too harsh, and it's like, no. Like I have
Like, I'm just a dude on the fucking
obligation.
internet. Like, what the fuck? Like, I'm not some, like, anarchy teacher here.
Well,
Come on now.
Well, plus the beauty of like the beauty of anarchy is that I don't need anybody else to believe in it or understand it for it to be true and for me to live in that system. Like, to choose to live in that system. I don't need to convince anybody else that I'm right. That's the reality. We want to because we give a shit about these things that are happening and these systems that we live under and the kind of atrocities that are happening. Like, we give a shit because we are moral people. Most anarchists are extremely moral people, which is another reason why the you just want to be rapist warlord thing pisses me off. Like, anarchy is a moral philosophy. It's an extremely moral philosophy. We wouldn't have suggested
It's a
that the state
refusal
is
to
evil.
indulge into violence at all
Exactly.
in all contexts.
And yeah, I mean, it's just, I don't know. It's the kind of shit that pisses me off. It's like, you don't need people to agree with you for this to be true. And I think you brought up the point today is that like a lot of people demand centralized power solutions to problems when you say that the state can't get it done. They go, all right, well, what's your system that you'd put in place in order to take care of this problem? And it's like, you don't understand the conversation here, do you? Because
markets
you're
are
asking somebody who is. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just like, basically, like, the nature of markets is when operative feature of it is the division of labor. And I'm a cook, and I'm sit down and talk about politics on the internet. I do those things, but I might not fucking run a private defense company, or that security company, or an insurance company that operates without the state. Like, all these things are things that, like, I can talk about the possibilities of, but ultimately the anarchist solution to it, or the anarcho-capitalist solution to it, is that the market figures it out, and the market is comprised of people who specialize under certain things that appeal to them, and those people are going to provide the solutions to a much better. Like, I couldn't tell you how to land a rocket on a heavenly body, and then make it take off again and land back on Earth, or whatever the fuck it is that SpaceX did with their bullshit. But they figured it out. I didn't have to. If somebody was like, "What's the anarchist solution to being able to do that shit?" I wouldn't be able to tell you the answer. But a private company did figure out how to do that. With a lot of public funds. I'll give SpaceX that. But
Right. I mean, ultimately, it boils down to, okay, so what's your solution? It's like, well, every single person, if we were all experiencing the same problem, would then choose a solution tailored to them. I don't get why that's a
well,
bad thing.
and another thing too is that it's this doubt that, oh, when I say the market is going to find a solution, they're like, well, okay, well, why do you have this faith that the solution is going to pop up? And you have to bring it back to supply and demand. It's like, okay, well, supply is something that is provided if there's opportunity to have money made off of it, or if there's an opportunity for profit in some manner, then supply usually pops up to meet that demand, or to alleviate that demand. And how do I know that there is societal demand for such solutions? Is that anytime I bring up anarchy, anytime I bring up removing the state from the equation, people bring up these issues. They bring up, well, what happens about Thoreau's, or what happens, about the things that police do, like in stopping domestic violence, or responding to robberies, or putting jailing people who are violent and stuff. And it's like, well, if there's really a demand to deal with that sort of element within society that's like outside of people dealing with themselves, then private means of arbitration in courts are going to pop up. And then private means of security are gonna pop up. They'll probably be hired by business owners, or the people who have like business interests, and maybe written within contracts for buying houses or property comes coverage of a certain private security company with the option to drop it and choose a better one. And so there's ways of structuring these things privately with voluntary inclusion and exclusion. And that's just some political scientists like spitballing off the top of their head. That's not even us being experts in the field of providing those services. It really ultimately comes down to the fact that demand clearly exists, because anybody who thinks of who hears about the state being erased from the equation immediately jumps into these issues and says, what happens if this happens? It's, well, everybody that's like you who immediately becomes concerned about that is suddenly going to create demand on the market for that solution to be alleviated. And therefore, people will create those solutions to alleviate that demand. That's how supply and demand works. That's why markets are superior. That's why we want to implement them and voluntary interaction in place of government are actually inefficient compared to market.
They're extremely inefficient.
Yeah.
Prisons. Anything that calls into question the existence of the system those schools belong to.
State overreach is a perpetual threat to individual liberty. The state insists on scrutinizing the lives of its subjects, but resists reform, transparency, and accountability.
The individual actors in government are not bearing the costs, the net costs of their actions. If you want people if you want individual rationality to lead to group rationality, you need some mechanism such that when I take an action, I bear most of the net costs. I get the benefits and pay the costs. And on the market, that's mostly true, though not perfectly true, ordinary private market. But in the political market, it's almost never true. That if I vote for the bad candidate and he gets elected, the costs of that are distributed around at least my country and maybe the world. If I'm a judge and I make a decision that sets a bad precedent, I'll never know that it was a bad precedent. I'm imagining a precedent which changes the legal system just a little bit, and a very small change in the legal system might produce costs of, say, $100 million a year. Huge amount of damage for one person to make.
Commerce Clause, for example, which gives Congress only the power to regulate interstate commerce, and which to Madison regulate meant to keep regular. Marshall and his colleagues in subsequent courts have interpreted to allow Congress to do nearly anything it wants. The color of your shirt, the thickness of the soles on your shoes, the pigment on the paint, the brightness of the lights, the curvature of the lens, all these things are absurdly regulated by the feds.
So I think there's really two reasons why businesses feel the need to lobby and interact with the state. So one, they want to get privileges over their competitors, and they want to try and get some sort of subsidy.
And I don't mean to be mean, but I'm not sure what it is with economists and badly fitting suit jackets. Seems to be consistent.
Well, yeah, it's I think it's academics in general. They're just they're not focused on the aesthetic.
Too busy to go to a tailor, damn it.
Restrictions.
I mean, seriously,
monopolistic
think
rights
about
of
stuff.
privileges that can give them an edge over their competitors, so they act as political entrepreneurs. The other tendency is that their competitors are also doing the exact same thing, as well as other interest groups. So various ideologues, reformers, socialists, unions, etc., and they feel the need to basically block hostile regulation that's coming and threatening. So in other words, they have to play both the offense and the defense. So they're in the political arena to secure benefits and shape regulation to their advantage.
I remember one time that a cop said to a friend of mine, he caught a friend of mine, we were 14, and he said he smelled weed. And we actually weren't smoking weed. And he could have easily caught us like an hour later and we probably would have been, but we weren't smoking weed. And my friend was really scared and he got...
You ever have one of those? It's like, you know what, officer? Normally you'd be right, but not at this moment. No. And that doesn't, that's usually not very convincing. You're like, wait a second. So you do smoke tons of weed? Yeah, I smoke tons of weed all the time, but like not today, not now. Didn't catch me this time.
In his face and put a flashlight right in his face. And he said, "Are you scared? I want to watch you piss your pants in front of me." To a 14-year-old child.
If a police officer stops you, you don't have, even if you know that you're innocent, you don't have the freedom to tell them, no, I don't want to deal with you. No, they have a monopoly on force. They can initiate force, initiate violence up to and including killing you if you do not abide by what they have to say.
A pretty close state to absolute power. In the dynamic of a cop, particularly a cop with a teenager, but in general, a cop. I mean, like even things will be like, well, I didn't consent to that search. Well, what happens if a cop says in court you did? It's your word against the cops. Who are they going to side with? They side with the cop every time. So there's two dynamics. There's one that power corrupts, and so you give people this power. None of us do well.
International law is a legal system that is created without an overarching sovereign. In a sense, it mimics anarchist law.
It's a bunch of different states, and they interact with each other in an environment where there isn't a higher power that hands down what the rules are of the game and how everyone shall behave. The international system is self-governed in the sense that all the states work together at least ostensibly, as equals.
So international law, I believe, can serve as a model for how we could imagine the possibility of a stateless order, because we do have 200 citizens of the world which don't have an overarching super sovereign. So it's possible to have peace among actors that are decentralized and that are sovereign with respect to themselves and don't have an overlord that forces them to comply with some kind of set of rules. So the Hobbesian idea that you can have order among individuals without a government to tell them what to do is sort of disproved by the existence of the international order and international law.
The question is, how would we apply that then down to a lower and lower level? And the key issue would be just to keep adding more and more choice among people actually living in these places in terms of different legal systems that they can choose from, different societies, and so on.
Anarchism can be difficult to define. In spite of often being incorrectly used to mean chaos, the word actually comes from the Greek word anarchia, meaning without a ruler. The earliest traces of anarchist thought date back to ancient Greek.
All it means is that we can't measure anything, and that's it. No rulers, no measuring. Society goes on.
Yeah, exactly.
In China, where many philosophers questioned the legitimacy of the state. Taoist sages like Su and Zhang Zhao developed a non-rule type of philosophy that would eschew any type of political involvement. Ancient Greece also gave rise to some early anarchist thought. In 300 BC, Zeno of Citium founded Stoicism. Heavily influenced by the Cynics, his Republic advocates for removing all state structures. Gerard Winstanley, who was part of the Diggers movement during the English Civil War, would become the foremost prominent proponent of Christian anarchism. He published a pamphlet in which he drew upon the Bible, claiming that the blessings on earth should be common to all, and that none lord over others. He argued for communal ownership. In 1703, Louis Armand, Baron de Lautoin, used the word anarchy in his New Voyages in North America to describe the peaceful indigenous people as having no state and no prisons. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, especially in his Discourse on Inequality, had a strong impact on anarchism. He argued that due to man's good nature, state was oppressive. In 1793, William Godwin.
Dude, man's nature, state is oppressive. Yeah. And so I think that's the most ironic bit about the whole human nature makes states necessary. No, human nature makes states oppressive and always will.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I don't think that people, I don't think that people skew towards authoritarianism, not naturally. Like the fact that for most of our existence, like initially that guy was saying at the beginning of the video, the fact that for most of our existence we didn't, and that it took a concerted effort and a constant bombardment of just, propaganda and education by the state to get people to start to think of this as the norm is kind of proof of that. Like, sure, people might skew that way now, but that's because they've been culturally bred, through this massive, generational psyop to get people to just kind of be like, yep, that's just how people are, man. This is just how it's always been, and this is how it has to be, and there's no reason to challenge it or try anything new because the results would be disastrous, and we know that because of reasons.
Yeah, I know. I'm confident we can win because it's correct.
First anarchist texts inquiring
reason why
concerning political justice around
people
the end of the
rebel
18th
against
century.
authority so consistently.
Yeah.
Godwin was the first to use anarchism as the name of a philosophy which would ultimately be popularized by the end of the 19th century. Max Stirner, who wrote The Ego and Its Own, Stirner advocated for a more radical type of individualism. Stirner argued we are all egoists, doing everything for our own advantage. Stern did not believe there were rights or transcendent morality, labeling such things as spooks created by the powerful to oppress. Left anarchism has a rich spectrum of ideas, bridging ecology.
I do want to read The Ego in His Own. I heard it's a pretty good one for history of like individualism.
Labor relations, social and sexual inequality. Authors like Murray Bookchin and Noam Chomsky were strongly associated with left anarchism, particularly anarcho-syndicalism. Emma Goldman was a prominent anarchist activist, once known as the most dangerous woman in America. She was born in
Syndicalism being centered around trade unions. It's like main system of like market organization.
what is now Lithuania and moved to the U.S. in 1885. She heavily influenced and lectured on anarchist philosophy, women's rights, and social issues of the day. She founded the anarchist journal Mother Earth in 1906. Voltairine de Cleyre was an American anarchist and contemporary of Emma Goldman, who ultimately advocated for anarchism without adjectives, foregoing descriptions
I've heard of her.
such as individualist, communist, mutualist, or collectivist. She was staunchly against the state and the existence of a standing army. Her contributions to anarchism and her lecture named Sex Slavery helped create the foundations of anarcho-feminism. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon published his What is Property in 1840, which would prove to become a highly influential book on anarchist thought. Proudhon argued property, as most people understand it, is theft. That being said, he also argued that property that was a result of labor was legitimate, but property of unused land or that profits from rent or interest was illegitimate. Proudhon argued, to be governed is to be watched, inspected, spied on, directed, law-driven, numbered, regulated, enrolled, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, checked, estimated, valued, censured, commanded, by creatures who have neither the right nor the wisdom nor the virtue to do so. His philosophy, which has influenced anarchist thought across the spectrum, was called mutualism. There was also Mikhail Bakunin. Bakunin argued that freedom and equality were inseparable. Bakunin said in The Political Philosophy of Bakunin, Scientific Anarchism, we are convinced that freedom without socialism is privilege and injustice, and that socialism without freedom is slavery and brutality. Bakunin's philosophy is called collectivist anarchism. At the end of the 19th century came Peter Kropotkin. Kropotkin wanted to synthesize communism and anarchism, creating anarcho-communism. Kropotkin argued with those who sought to use Darwin's new theory of evolution to justify racial and class inequality. Kropotkin argued that mutual aid, rather than the dominant gene in a species, that the defining feature of evolution was actually mutual aid. Kropotkin also wrote The Conquest of Bread. This book was hugely influential on anarchists in Catalonia as well as in the modern-day Rojava. This created a divide in the 19th century between anarchists who were communists and those who were not. Mutualists believed in individual property rights, but with equal access to lands sans taxation and sans profit. Anarcho-communists, on the other hand, believed the community rather than the individual should be in control of property, removing all market transactions, and would adopt the Marxist principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his need. There were also anarchists in America who were influenced by both Proudhon's mutualism as well as by classical liberalism. Josiah Ward, who put his theories to the test with a labor-for-labor store, Cincinnati Times store, in which trade notes were issued backed by the promise of labor. This was the first store to function this way and actually proved quite successful before Warren's decided to close shop in order to pursue colonies based on his understanding of mutualism. Warren's settlement, Modern Times, whose name would later be changed to Brentwood, had no government, no clearly defined laws, and no money, yet absolutely no crime and very little commotion. Another American anarchist, Benjamin Tucker, said of Warren that he was the first man to expound and formulate the doctrine now known as anarchism. Speaking of Benjamin Tucker, he was another anarchist who described himself as an unterrified Jeffersonian. Tucker's focus was on his fear of central planning, fearing that it may have destroyed any hope for either anarchy or central planning. A more controversial claim of Tucker's echoed only by anarchists hostile to communism, was anarchism is a word without meaning unless it includes the liberty of the individual to control his product or whatever his product has brought him through the exchange in a free market. That is, private property. Whoever denies private property is of necessity an anarchist. Gustave de Molinari wrote The Production of Security in 1849. Murray Rothbard would consider him to be the great innovator in the market provision of security. Then we have Lysander Spooner, who is influential to both left-leaning anarchists as well as anarcho-capitalists. Lysander Spooner was an abolitionist and a constitutional lawyer. In 1845, he wrote The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. Spooner used both legal and natural law arguments to prove the Constitution in fact did not support slavery. He acknowledged the founding fathers of America probably did not intend to end slavery, but only the meaning of the text and not the individual intentions of its authors were enforceable. He later pamphlets on jury nullification, as well as legal advice for escaped slaves, and gave legal services to fugitives. The debate between communist anarchists and non-communists would become so hotly contested that some make the case it may be why some anarchists, anarcho-capitalists, reject socialism altogether, opting to incorporate classic liberal ideals such as homesteading, moving away from socialism and towards an anarchist form of classical liberalism. Anarcho-capitalism is a school of anarchism that advocates individual autonomy and private property.
What happened was that over the last several centuries, starting in the 17th and going up to the 18th and 19th century, we had a march, an upward march, not of course every day, but basically an upward march of freedom. And the death of the old order, which was statism and serfdom and slavery and theocracy. And rising up from this muck, was the idea of individual freedom and the institutions of individual freedom. Personal freedom, religious freedom, political freedom, economic freedom, free market.
He had a really comprehensive knowledge, not just of economics, but of political theory, philosophy, and many other subjects. And he had a
political history,
tremendous intellectual curiosity about all things. He was,
rather the history of political philosophy. Really interesting book series. It was the history of economic thought. Yeah, it basically goes through like the concepts of like natural rights and concepts like not insurance. What the heck is the yearly percentage that you not fuck me. Like when you take a loan, the percentage that you
Oh, interest.
Interest, not insurance. Yeah, there you go. Interest. I don't know why I couldn't think of that. Yeah. So like the ideas of interest and like how that progressed, because some, especially amongst like because a lot of the people who were writing the moral and then therefore the actual political law were like religious leaders, Catholics, and things like that. And so how they viewed what they called usury and what was acceptable and what wasn't, and like exceptions and all that stuff changed over the years. So yeah, he describes like all of that great details. I mean, it's a long book series, but it's pretty good.
he was constantly coming up with new ideas, and he was very enthusiastic about the new ideas he found.
First is the non-aggression principle, NAP. Keep your mitts to yourself and don't grab other people with their property without their permission.
Walter Block has a good book. I think it's called Defending the Undefendable. There's a couple of other ones.
Now, in boxing, if you and I are in a boxing match and you punch me in the nose, I can't say, oh, assault and battery, because I've agreed to be hit above the belt. The second one would be private property rights. And we need private property rights because suppose you grab this shirt that I'm now wearing. Did you violate the non-aggression principle? Well, it all depends upon who owns this shirt. If I stole it from you yesterday, you're just repossessing your property, and I'm the bad guy. On the other hand, it's my shirt, keep your mitts off, and if you grab it, you're the bad guy. So we have to know who is the owner of my shirt. And the third one is free association. No one should be forced or compelled to associate with anyone against his will. One of the direct effects of the non-aggression principle, the NAP, N-A-P, is no government. That would be the purest libertarian view. Why? Because government taxes people against their will. And we just got finished saying that the non-aggression principle says that you shouldn't be forced to do anything. You should be able to do anything you damn well please, except keep your mitts off of other people. Well, when they're taxing us, that violates the non-aggression principle and it violates free association. They're making us associate with them. And where do we get that from? I didn't sign the Constitution.
The idea that rights are simple and clear and therefore you can eliminate everything by, you can solve all problems by showing you can't do that because it violates rights. And some of those, I guess my favorite counter to that, which comes from Bill Bradford, who was the editor of Liberty Magazine. He's no longer alive, unfortunately, but he was an interesting guy. And he says, all right, this is my memory of his example. You happen to be you fall off your balcony on the 15th floor of an apartment building, unfortunately. But fortunately, there's a flagpole coming off the balcony on the 14th floor, just below you, and you manage to grab hold of that. It doesn't break, and you're going hand over hand back to the 14th floor balcony to get on it and get down. When the owner of that apartment comes onto his balcony and he says, that flagpole is my property, not yours, let go. Do you? Well, if the answer is that you don't, we have to either say that's because you're a bad person, you've just violated his rights, or you have to say it is morally legitimate to violate rights when enough is at stake, which is basically what this comes to. But once you've conceded that it's morally right to violate rights when enough is at stake, now you've abandoned the moral argument against almost everything.
I know lots of people have different visions of what this looks like. But let's say we're talking about an extremely decentralized covenant community where people just come together and form communities where they sign a contract and I agree to live in this place and follow these rules. And as I argue in some of my essays, this is probably the likely way that most people would live. A lot of people imagine that, oh, well, I'll just go out and do my own thing out in the countryside and no one will bother me. This is, of course, an extremely naive way of looking at things, is that your neighbors would probably just come and try and take your stuff away. So most people would congregate into a group of some kind and then agree to give up certain prerogatives in order to amass their resources and put together a private security force and so on.
I think when it comes to the most widely understood cases of
Yeah, I mean, the easiest thing to imagine is that if people are getting contracts to live, in units within the same building, then that could easily be written into the contracts, some sort of shared, like, emergency procedure exemptions.
Right, and
Like that.
it's like it's being written into the contract. You read the contract, you're aware of it, you either consent to that contract or you don't, but it's voluntary. You're choosing, and that's the it's voluntary. You're choosing to do that. We don't eschew people having these interactions or contracts or anything like that. Our problem is that they're not voluntary when it's through the state. They're not voluntary.
unjustified aggression, there is a pretty broad range of agreement. I mean, yeah, not everybody thinks taxation is theft, but virtually everybody thinks murder can't be justified. Virtually everybody thinks you can't break into somebody's house and take his things. And that's the baseline we operate from. And if there are a handful of people who don't accept that, well, that's what we have self-defense for.
I think it's just a numbers game. Like it's just how many people believe in the moral legitimacy of the ruling class, because people say, well, how do we end this? How do we end that? And there are people using cryptos to undermine the extortion racket, which is awesome. There are people who are big on Second Amendment rights and like we need guns, so we have the right to, so we have the ability to forcibly defend if they do this, which I'm fine with that too. But to me, it's a numbers game. Like if there's only a few of us, we're doomed. You can run off and hide in a cabin in the woods or something, and you might get away with that. But I want to see the whole world become free and rational and moral.
Agorism is the school of anarchist thought developed by Samuel Edward Konkin III. Konkin advocated for peaceful counter-economics with the intent to starve the state of funding.
Sam and Neil were driving across country, actually. They were at college in New York, and they were driving across country, and they worked out the details of agorism. And Neil put it into his book alongside Knight. If I recall correctly, Sam was supposed to have a book come out, but he couldn't find a publisher. So Neil, who he's friends with Heinlein and a lot of different authors, he was a little bit more established in the writing scene. He put out alongside Knight, and that was really the foundational text of agorism.
The main thing is just pretty much bleeding the state dry, staying out of the state in is any way possible, like not paying taxes, cash transactions and all that, but with the idea of doing it to stay away from government.
The white market, which is obviously the acceptable market, everybody trades in that, taxes, regulations. Then there's the gray markets, which is, it's a legal business, but you're not paying taxes, you're a tax evader or whatever, and you're not claiming everything, or it's not regulated.
Karl Hess was one of the early agorists. He used to be Republican. He worked for Barry Goldwater, and he coined the term or the phrase, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. And eventually he became more and more of an anarchist, and he got in with Sam Konkin and all those guys, and he wrote Community Technology, which is I hesitate to call it a book because it's so small, it's really just a booklet, where he describes his whole experience in the Adams Morgan neighborhood in Washington, D.C., where he creates this whole farm in an urban environment. And what's really striking to me is that if you can do that in Washington, D.C., you can do that anywhere.
Nobody is capable by revolutionary action of overturning great social systems. It has never been done. There hasn't been a revolution by armed force ever in the history of the world. What we have had is changes of management very often, but no revolution.
Crypto anarchy. So the idea is essentially that the use of cryptography will help us subvert or undermine the state. And I think that's absolutely huge to where we are in the future. Not just in terms of blockchains, but also, like we said, in terms of Tor as well. So
Actually, just reading some stuff about this today.
Yeah.
I may have reblogged. Let me see if I can find it. It's right here. I reblogged. It's the Second Rome Handbook PDF that I reblogged today, and there is a specific, actually a pretty large portion of that it speaks about. Let's see. Let me see if I can find some, just like a good sum up here. Basically they're talking about like the idea of like starving the state out by creating parallel markets and economy and even culture in the state. And they do use examples. Now they do put a caveat before they really get into it, but they're saying that organizations like the Mafia and the Yakuza are really good examples of things like this, because they create parallel markets and cultures and even like whole societies that exist completely outside of the purview of the state. Now they do say that they, being immoral people, have chosen to do really horrible things,
But
within these,
that's the funny thing is because the popular mantra is the state is a protection racket, and it is only fitting that the mafia and the Yakuza being like smaller, localized protection rackets would be examples, successful ones that work better than the state, even if they have some of the same flaws.
And yeah, I mean, it is absolutely true that like the mafia has committed like some horrible things against innocent people, and it's also true that the mafia has done a lot of like community outreach and good at the same time, you know? So yeah, it is an interesting, I guess, parallel to bring up, but that was a really interesting thing that they were talking about.
That was like relevant.
Right. Yeah, that I was reading through because I mean, yeah, it is an interesting perspective to look at, that you're talking about, you're not necessarily talking about like an armed revolution because like the guy was saying, we've just seen a change in management, not necessarily an actual revolution that breaks down the system. We're just putting new people in charge. And this is proposing that like the most long-term and actual effective solution is just withdraw and then create your own parallel economy and society that's just outside of the purview of the state, and they literally can't do anything about it.
Right. Yeah. Interesting to have run a restaurant in some manner.
It would be.
Again, we have things like the Silk Road where you can buy and sell at will whatever you want to whomever you want without any form of regulation or censorship by Congress or your governor, your state legislature. Crypto anarchy is that is to me what's going to save us. And I think the crypto anarchists have become essentially a wing of the agorist movement.
Anarchy is just normal life that happens all around us every day. When we walk down the street, we all have a vested interest in just having a society where we deal with one another peaceably and we deal with one another in ways that we feel are justified and win-win. I mean, anarchy is just in the air around us. It's not something abstract. It's just human beings doing what they want to do voluntarily, without force, without coercion.
We can distinguish between individualist anarchism, which is based on private property ownership, and other types of anarchism that are more of a communitarian kind that don't recognize private property.
I think that by anarchist societies, and by anarchism in general, compared to its popular use as chaos, disorder, violence, and so on, the anarchism ought to be understood as forms of cooperation and mutuality without hierarchy.
I think the developers would develop towns and cities, and people that lived in towns already and so on. Those would be the public areas, let's say, would then be owned as almost as stockholders. People in the town would be stockholders in those public areas.
But I think you could have any number of organizations where people come together and form a variety of communal organizations, own communal property, have communally owned towns and cities and so on. Those could all certainly meet the definition. I think the key component there is that you would have a lot of choice about where you would live.
In 1860, Paul-Émile Dupuit coined the term panarchy, which is a system that
By the way, we're like over halfway, so I don't know if you're going or if you want to wrap it up.
Let's give it another 15 minutes. We'll hit it at 11:30.
Cool.
recognizes the individual's right to choose any form of government without being forced to move from their current locale.
Panarchy, to me, is one of the next stages of human social evolution. Instead of pure anarchy, okay, which sometimes you might think of anarchy, or some people might think of anarchy as just being utopian, being fanciful. Panarchy is a way of describing arrangements where we don't make any sort of judgments about the kinds of civil association that people want to enter into, but they do that rather freely. And what's interesting about panarchy is it's different from polycentrism, which is another fancy P word that just means we're breaking up power into smaller jurisdictions and allowing for people to vote with their feet. If they don't like this jurisdiction, they can go to the other one. Polycentrism is this idea, and it's really important. You can join your Republican or Democrat or Socialist or what have you association and in your home. So instead of joining a party that fights over who gets to control 350 million people, say, a panarchic state of affairs would just be, if you believe in joining a kibbutz, or you believe in the Singaporean healthcare system, or if you believe in some other set of governance arrangements, be they hierarchical or decentralized, you can join those and you can exit them if they're not working out for you. You get a market and governance that is divorced from territory. We have to ask ourselves now in this day and age, why is it that rules have to be attached to territory always and in every case? They don't need to be. And in fact, for most things, the rules we live under are an artifact of conquest, or an artifact of, I was born on this patch of soil that long time ago was conquered by somebody who...
I'm assuming the implication for this is that they're all anarchic systems, because obviously with any authoritarian one, then they would naturally like to grow their area of rule, their territory.
Right. It's the nature of the state to expand and to expand as far as it possibly can.
Because I think he is describing like his own like brand of integrated anarchy, right? Without adjectives or without favoritism towards a particular system. And then also being able to make it compatible like territorially, and like competitive territorially, rather than a rising conflict.
Makes the rules on my behalf. It doesn't have to be this way, but the panarchist says, let's try different experiments and let's see who joins what civil associations, and then we can just have mechanisms for settling disagreements between those civil associations.
Whether or not anarchists should utilize politics to try to shrink the state is a hotly debated topic.
Recently, on the federal level, we got a right to try bill, which says that if you are suffering from a terminal disease and there's some experimental drug you might be able to take, we're going to give you the option to take it. But that began as on the state level, as a series of states began introducing right to try laws. Now, there's no authorization for a right to try law on the national level. They were just doing it. And as it turns out, they paved the way for a liberation that occurred on the national level. And you can go down the 10th Amendment Center. You can go down the list of the various initiatives they have, and you'll see how many of them there are on such a wide array of issues that might appeal to both left and right. If I look through the history of so-called states' rights, in the first, let's say, 150 years of American history, what do I find it being used for? Well, I find it being used to defend the freedom of speech, to defend against unconstitutional searches and seizures, to defend against a military draft during the War of 1812 that was proposed that some people like Congressman and then Senator Daniel Webster thought was unconstitutional. But in fact, they were even used to fight against slavery. And we see that not only in the personal liberty laws, which were used to fight against the fugitive slave laws that existed in the 19th century. We have states, for example, refusing to allow the federal government to use its facilities, to use its jails to hold suspects, or to let any state official take part in running after a fugitive slave or anything like that.
The whole thing is the principle of secession, I think, is very, very good. I sort of lean toward the nonviolent approach, but I always support secession. And I think that the founders made a mistake by not having that in the Constitution, because that would have restrained the government. If we could have, as individual states, leave the United States anytime we want, they would have been much more reserved in the abuse of the rights that the states should have and the rights of the individuals within the states.
Secession is an approach you take when you have irreconcilable differences. That's in effect what happens. Right now in the United States, we have well over 300 million people, and we are divided right down the middle in how we look at the world. We have radically different worldviews. And instead of saying, why don't we work on an arrangement where people who think one way can just live according to those ideas and people who think another way can live that way? Instead, we feel like we have to win and triumph over our enemies. Well, there has to be one way to think that dominates the entire country. And at some point you should ask yourself, is that really the most civilized way for us to organize society? Is that the most civilized way for human beings to live with each other? And I'm inclined to think that it would be better if we said, look, we just don't have the same vision for what society ought to be, and instead of every 4 years having a low-intensity civil war with each other to see who's going to ram ideas down the throats of the others, what if we say, well, why don't you live your way and we'll live our way, and we'll see, let the best man win kind of thing.
I think the idea that, people just keep voting for someone who's better than the last clown that was in there, or we just got to wait for the Republican or Democrat systems to reform themselves and to offer us some new candidates, that clearly isn't working. People have been trying that for a really long time now. And so I think if you're disgusted by the current system and you agree the current system is crazy, the very least you can do is stop legitimizing it by voting every 2 or 4 years, because that's really the fig leaf that they hide behind, is to say, this system is voluntary in a sense because look at these leaders were democratically elected.
So I would just
see,
say,
and that's why when people start saying, well, if you're not voting, then you're not doing anything, and you can't ever change anything, and who cares because now you don't have a voice, that's the fucking response. Right there. It's
Anarchists
like,
never
no,
offer any
I
solutions.
am.
They just criticize.
Yeah, it's like, no, I am stepping back from this, and I'm refusing to legitimize it, and you are legitimizing it. So right off the bat, it's like I'm doing more than you. You only perceive that you're doing more because this is the bone that they throw you to keep participating in the system over and over and over again. You might win every once in a while, but that's how they string you along. That's exactly how it works. It's the long con. It's exactly how it works.
Definitely.
I do believe most of the victories you're likely to have are going to come at your local level. You have no chance of influencing the U.S. Senate to do anything. But on your local level, well, you could, you might even know your local state legislator. I mean, he might actually live on your street. There is a possibility that you could get some tax repealed or some onerous regulation repealed.
The next level of libertarianism below that would be minarchism. Ayn Rand, Robert Nozick. And there they support the non-aggression principle, but they allow government, very minimal government, to have armies, courts, and police. Armies not to export democracy, but to just make sure bad guys don't come from abroad and attack us. Police not to
bad guys.
Make people virtuous, but to just make sure that murderers and rapists don't do their thing and leave victimless
Walter Bluock?
criminals alone, like prostitution and drugs.
Everybody's a minarchist. Who's not an anarchist? Joseph Stalin was a minarchist. Bernie Sanders is a minarchist. If you're just going to say, well, I think the state should do X, Y, Z, well, why not X, Y, Z and A, B, C? And while we're at it, E, F, G, and a whole bunch of other things. I mean, either you're guided by first principles or you're not, and you're just in the realm of preferences. And, anarchists get accused of being utopian, but there is nothing more utopian than a minarchist. The idea that a state will stay restrained because it just decides it doesn't want more power. We're going to create a monopoly on the initiation of violence, and they'll probably decide we'll only stay, a certain reasonable size. Well, I mean, how much empirical evidence do you need to disprove the idea that that's even possible? And in fact, there's a pretty strong correlation between relatively small states becoming the biggest states. It's not a coincidence that the United States of America, which started as this experiment in restrained government, with all these brilliant thinkers who wrote all about checks and balances and divisions of power, well, now it's the biggest state that's ever existed in the history of humanity.
The most effective strategy for bringing about a stateless society
Who could have predicted?
is not politics at all. I don't think we're going to send our prayers up in the voting booth and hope that the authorities grant us this kind of supreme freedom.
No, I guess if they're gonna start part 2 right there, then good spot to probably wrap it up.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect spot actually. And
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and you know, I mean, not that I'm not saying that I necessarily need the validation, but this is the kind of, I mean, this is the shit that I talk about. I've said these things before. I believe this stuff, and it's nice to see that I'm at least, not that it's validating, but that I've come to these conclusions through logic, clear logic that other people can obviously follow.
Yeah. It's
Like this isn't just
intuitive
me.
enough that other people come to it independently as well.
Right. It's not just me following my own biases. I'm looking at things objectively enough that there are other people that are going, you know, this is like the way to functionally shut down this system is not to keep feeding it. Obviously, like it doesn't work that way. Nobody's ever voted themselves out of an oppressive regime. And again, the flip side is also that, you know, a lot of these revolutions like do eventually fail. Even the French Revolution eventually failed because there's no widespread cultural change. Like the core of the problem is still there, and that's that people don't think that, well, we need to get rid of this state entirely and move on from this. I mean, it's outdated, it's inefficient, and
It is just
it's outdated.
Seize power and uses, you know, the leverage for your purposes.
Right. They don't move on past that thing. They just think, well, if we did it in a different way, it would be better, you know? And I think that that's ultimately also true that, you know, without people choosing to look at other systems or to even just start questioning why we do things the way we do them, there is no long-term solution. And so people really have to start questioning not just, you know, if we do it, is this the way, you know, to do government, but why the hell are we doing this at all in the first place? Like we've tried it a dozen different ways and it seems to result in the same thing. Well, maybe we need to go back a little further and understand that the core principle here is what's flawed.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the issues that we see nowadays with regards to like poverty and unemployment and like all these sorts of things are that are going to be much better organized without the state, right? Including obviously job opportunities once like rules like the minimum wage are erased, but also, I mean, on the monetary side, without the Federal Reserve, like our monetary system will be much more stable and backed by hard currency, and our ability to confidently trade with one another and to reap the rewards of our profits is going to be, you know, much more consistent and stable. And so it's really hard to describe to people without sounding like utopic, like, listen, everything's just going to be so much better. It's like, well, I do believe it is the best system, and it's going to give us not only decentralized like freedom, decentralization gives us freedom from state control, but that freedom from state control and further like return of control to individuals' hands is what allows us to create much better like market scenarios that actually fulfill our needs rather than sort of feed into some sort of corporate government leeching mechanism.
Right. And I mean, I feel like the accusation of utopia again is just off the wall because there is in any system that way that we're proposing there is very much a very large onus of individual responsibility. Like, you know, there's a lot that people are going to have to take upon themselves that they're not going to be able to outsource to the state anymore. I don't necessarily see that as being a bad thing. Like, yes, it is more work. Yes, some people will fail at doing it because that's how freedom works. Like, you're no longer going to have this guarantee of outcome anymore, um, because there's nobody enforcing it, which is fine. Like, that's okay. Like, you can acknowledge that that you know some people will fail, and yeah, that's sad. But the alternative is, you know, work. Like, it's horrible. Like, the alternative is horrible.
Well,
Like, what it actually requires is extremely bad.
well, and the pressure, like incentive wise, is to then be much more cognizant over the successful and the unsuccessful strategies of, you know, doing a particular business, or consideration of whatever, you know, market forces go into making things work or fail. And, you know, the people who are more cognizant and more specialized in that regard are going to be the ones who succeed more, and that's going to be all the better for us and what's provided on the market. Because as soon as those people start to fail in their delivered promises, then there's other people who are, you know, striving, because the good income or whatever, the reward, the monetary reward for being that specialized and for being that useful on the market is then an attraction to others to learn that expertise, you know, that speciality, that's the same level expertise, in order to get part of the market share and to get part of the clientele that earns such a high salary. And, you know, then the price levels out, or people get much better and prove themselves in even further ways. This, yeah, this is all the stuff that makes further advances, you know, more accessible to everybody, without need for these like corporate conglomerates that are controlling regulations and what's allowed to be sold or what's allowed to be consented
Everything,
upon.
basically. Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. And, you know, again, it's kind of that thing again. People talk about. I always have to ask people that are really hardcore, very, you know, I don't want to call them constitution like lovers, but you know, people that are generally more on the conservative side of things, very patriotic, the Constitution. I always have to ask them what they think the phrase dangerous freedom meant when they talked about it. Like, what is? I mean, you know, people are talking about, you know, that they'd rather have dangerous freedom rather than, you know, this safety guaranteed by the state. Yeah. Well, it's like, what part of what did you think they meant
The
when they said
secure
dangerous
tyranny,
freedom?
yeah.
Like, what did you think that they meant when they said dangerous freedom? Did you think that they were like saying that, you know, if you're completely free, that you just everything would be great? It's like, no, they knew
There's
they
risk.
knew what it meant, that there's a lot of risk and that people would have to be, I say better. What I mean is more aware, I
They
think, of the things that go
this
around them.
they'd
And
have to be more directly involved in the solutions.
yes, yeah. That's a great way to put it. More directly involved in the solutions to their own problems. And so, yes, it does mean more work for a lot of us. Um, we fucking did it before, though. Like, we could do it again. We can.
Yeah, and the great thing about markets is that the division of labor still exists. Like, we still have
Yeah.
like we still have people.
Everybody will not have to be an expert in everything, you know?
yeah, we still have people who will be better at certain things and can provide certain contributions towards the market. I mean, that's how markets work nowadays. People create their own businesses, they become entrepreneurs. This is all, but with a stable money supply, a sound money, backed by real assets rather than fake fairy tales from the government.
Like nothing at this point.
And yeah, you've seen what that's done over the past like 110 years.
Oh, it's been awesome, right? Worked out super well. Oh.
Exactly. So yeah, I guess since that was part 1 of the Monopoly on Violence, and the last 40 minutes is going to be part 2. We'll take care of that. Not next week, but perhaps the week after that.
Yes, next week, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but we won't be streaming. My kid's got a baseball game. He's recently decided to get interested in baseball among all the other things he's interested in. So
Unfortunately, that fucking kid has fucking physical interests, and I mean, geez, how dare he have it on a day that interferes with our podcast?
No. I think it's good. He's tried a
course.
lot of different things in the last like year or two, and honestly, I love it. Like it's actually kind of like none of them seem to be like really similar to each other. He's gone from one thing to the next, just kind of trying a lot of different things, and I think it's great. Like he's not been particularly bad at any of them.
Take him climbing.
He just wants to try a lot of different things, and I think it's great. Like I want him to try as many things as he possibly can. I don't want him to get think he's only allowed to do one thing, and once he kind of decides what he wants to do, that's it, and he's stuck into it. Like I love it that he's got this really broad interest in all kinds of stuff. But baseball is his new thing, so we're trying that out.
No, that's cool. That's cool. Take him climbing though.
I honestly want to see if he'd get into it because I want to try it myself. I like working out more when it's something like that. I think
Yeah.
I'd be way more into that rather than just like repetitive, lifting or whatever, reps and shit like that. I think that would be a lot more fun. I've done it a few times when I was younger and I had a lot of fun doing it. So, who knows? Maybe see if he's interested in that once he gets over this baseball thing. If he gets over it, if he ends up really liking it, there's no reason why he can't do, that too. So,
Yeah,
there's a couple climbing gyms around here that I could take him to and see if he enjoys it.
Sweet. Yeah. Now for the upper body especially, it's an incredible workout that like he becomes like, it's surprisingly engaging, like just when you just do it, and you don't even really have to like think about the fact that like your shoulders and back and biceps and everything and forearms and fingers are all getting like worked out at the same time. And like you said, it's kind of like engaging in like a mental level, like it's a puzzle to be solved, because there's certain things that like if you're strong enough you can get through them, but also if you choose not to use strength and to think about how to shift your weight or to what footwork works properly, then you can make the same reach much easier, even physically, so that you don't have to power through it all, and you can save your strength for another spot on the boulder. But yeah, it's a super fun sport. I highly recommend it.
Definitely have to try it out. He's a very high energy little dude, so I think you'll have a good time.
Nice. Yeah, and so that's a stream for tonight. Thank you to anybody who stopped by and watched some of this movie with us. We'll finish it in 2 weeks. Later, everybody. Say goodbye, Hominis.